music stopped for Duke Alistair Grantham the moment he saw her face across the crowded ballroom. His glass slipped in his hand, and only a quick catch by his own fingers saved it from shattering on the marble floor. For 5 years he had trained himself not to look for her in every crowd, not to chase the curve of a cheek or the color of a dress across a room, because doing so only broke his heart again and again. Yet here she was, standing beneath the tall windows of the Royal Hall, laughing softly at something a young officer had said, her head tilted in a way that struck him like a blow to the chest. He did not move at first. He could not. The candlelight caught her hair, and though it was darker than he remembered, swept up in pearls instead of the simple braids she used to wear, the shape of her face was the same, the line of her jaw was the same. Even the small, private smile she gave when she was only half listening to a conversation was the same. Alistair felt the years fall away from him in an instant, and with them fell every wall he had built to survive the loss of his wife. Eleanor had died 5 years ago, or so everyone believed. Her carriage had gone off the road on a stormy night, into the river below the old stone bridge outside the estate. The searchers had found the wreckage 2 days later, torn apart by the current, but they never found her body. The vicar had held a service anyway, because there was nothing else to be done, and Alistair had stood at the front of the church in black, accepting condolences from people whose names he could not remember, while inside, he felt as though someone had carved out a piece of him and left the rest hollow. Since that night, the Duke had become a different man. He still ran his estates with a firm and fair hand. He still sat in the House of Lords when duty required it. He still hosted the occasional dinner because a man of his position could not simply vanish from society. But he no longer laughed easily. He no longer danced unless forced by protocol, and he never, not once in 5 years, allowed himself to be introduced to another woman with any hint of romantic intention. His mother despaired of him. His closest friend, Nathaniel Cole, worried for him constantly. And still Alistair remained, in the eyes of the world, a widower who refused to move on. Now, staring across the ballroom, he wondered if grief had finally broken something inside his mind. He had heard of men who saw the faces of their dead loved ones everywhere, in strangers on the street, in portraits, in dreams that felt too real to shake off. Perhaps this was simply another cruel trick of a heart that had never truly healed. He told himself this even as his feet began to carry him forward, weaving between dancing couples and clusters of gossiping nobles, his eyes never leaving her face. She noticed him when he was still several steps away. Her eyes, a clear shade of gray-blue that he remembered dreaming about more nights than he could count, met his, and for one impossible second he thought he saw a flicker of recognition there. Then it was gone, replaced by the polite, distant curiosity a stranger offers another stranger at a crowded party. She did not know him. Whoever she was, she looked at the Duke of Grantham the way anyone might look at an unfamiliar man crossing a room with too much urgency in his stride. "Forgive me," Alistair said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I did not mean to stare. You resemble someone I once knew." The young officer beside her, a lieutenant with a bright uniform and an easy smile, seemed ready to intervene, but the woman raised a hand slightly, a small gesture that silenced him without a word. Alistair recognized that gesture too. Eleanor used to do the very same thing when she wanted to speak for herself. "I am often told I have a common sort of face," the woman said, her voice carrying the faintest teasing note, though her eyes studied him with genuine curiosity now. "Though I confess, Your Grace, you look at me as though you have seen a ghost." She knew who he was. Of course she did. Everyone in the room knew the Duke of Grantham, even if he did not yet know her name. He forced himself to breathe, to steady the wild pounding of his heart, to behave like a man of reason rather than a man haunted. "I apologize for my rudeness," he said. "I am Alistair Grantham." "I know," she said, and there was something gentle in the way she said it, as though she pitied him a little for his obvious distress. "I am Clara Whitmore. I am companion to the Baroness Ashcombe, who is seated just there, growing impatient with me for abandoning her at the refreshment table." Clara Whitmore. The name meant nothing to him, and yet the sound of her voice saying it settled into his mind like a key turning in a lock he had thought rusted shut forever. He glanced past her shoulder and saw an elderly woman in deep violet silk watching them both with sharp, assessing eyes. The Baroness Ashcombe. He knew the name vaguely. An old family with modest means, more known for eccentricity than influence. "Miss Whitmore," Alistair said, testing the name on his tongue as though it might reveal something false in its shape. "May I ask where you are from?" A shadow crossed her face, quick and troubled, gone almost before he could be certain he had seen it. "That is rather a complicated question, Your Grace. I was found 5 years ago in a fishing village on the northern coast, injured, and with no memory of who I was before that day. The Baroness took pity on me, and gave me a place in her household. I have been Clara Whitmore for as long as I can remember, because there was no one else to tell me otherwise. The floor seemed to shift beneath Alistair's feet. 5 years. The same 5 years since the carriage went into the river. The northern coast was not so very far from where the water had carried debris downstream, if the currents had been strong enough, if fate had been cruel and kind in equal measure. He knew it was madness to build such a theory from a handful of coincidences, and yet his heart refused to listen to reason. That must have been very difficult for you, he managed to say, though his mind was racing far ahead of his words. I have made my peace with it, Clara replied, though something in her tone suggested the peace was hard-won and still fragile at the edges. One learns to build a life from whatever pieces remain. Though I admit, Your Grace, your reaction to my face has left me rather unsettled. You look at me as though you expect me to remember you. Perhaps I do, Alistair said quietly, and then, catching himself, he offered a small, apologetic bow. Forgive me again. It has been a strange evening for me. She studied him a moment longer, her head tilting in that familiar way, and he saw genuine kindness in her expression. The same warmth that had first drawn him to Eleanor all those years ago at their own introduction, back when they were both young and the world had seemed full of easy promises. Strange evenings sometimes lead to interesting conversations, Clara said. If you wish to speak further, Your Grace, I do not bite. The lieutenant beside her laughed at that, breaking some of the tension, and Alistair found himself almost smiling despite the storm inside his chest. They spoke for a few more minutes, polite and careful, skirting around the strange intensity of his first reaction, until the Baroness Ashcombe called Clara back to her side, with the particular impatience of the elderly and important. Before she left, Clara glanced back at him once, and in that glance Alistair thought he saw the faintest trace of confusion, as though some part of her recognized the pull between them even if her mind could not name it. He stood rooted in place long after she had gone, watching her retreat into the crowd, the pearls in her hair catching the candlelight one last time before she disappeared behind a cluster of dancing guests. Nathaniel Cole appeared at his side moments later, concern written plainly across his face. You look as though you have seen the dead walk, Nathaniel said quietly, following the direction of Alistair's gaze. Perhaps I have, Alistair murmured. He turned to his friend, and for the first time in 5 years, something other than grief burned in his eyes. It was not quite hope, not yet, because hope felt too dangerous a thing to allow himself, but it was something close to it, something he had thought long buried beside an empty grave with his wife's name carved into the stone above it. Nathaniel, he said, I need you to find out everything you can about Miss Clara Whitmore, companion to the Baroness Ashcombe. Everything. Where she was found, who found her, what state she was in, and why no one ever thought to ask further questions about a young woman who appeared from nowhere the same season my wife disappeared. Nathaniel's eyebrows rose, but he did not argue. He had watched his friend suffer for 5 long years, had sat with him through the worst of the grief, and he recognized now that something had shifted in the Duke's face, something that had not been there in a very long time. I will begin in the morning, Nathaniel said. Across the room, an elderly baroness in violet silk watched her young companion return with narrowed, curious eyes, sensing that something unusual had passed between Clara and the Duke, though she could not have guessed at its true weight. She had seen many young men fall suddenly silent in Clara's presence before, struck by a beauty that seemed somehow familiar, though none could ever say why, but she had never seen a grown man's composure shatter so completely in the span of a single glance. She resolved to ask Clara about it later, once the carriage had carried them safely home through the cold night streets. Alistair, for his part, remained near the edge of the dance floor for the rest of the evening, unable to summon the will to leave, watching Clara move through the crowd with the same easy grace that had once made Eleanor the most admired woman at every gathering she attended. He noticed the way she laughed with genuine warmth at a joke poorly told, the way she touched her earring absently when deep in thought, small unconscious gestures that struck him again and again with painful familiarity. Other men approached her throughout the night, drawn by her beauty and her quick wit, and Alistair felt an unfamiliar stab of jealousy each time, though he had no claim upon her, not yet, perhaps not ever, depending on what Nathaniel's inquiries might reveal. He thought of Eleanor's final morning often in the weeks that followed, replaying every detail as though searching for some clue he had missed at the time. She had kissed him goodbye at the door, promising to return before nightfall from her visit to a neighboring estate, her hand resting briefly on the small curve of her stomach where their child was growing. He remembered the particular shade of blue in her traveling cloak, the way she had laughed at something the driver said as the carriage pulled away down the long gravel drive. He had not known, could not have known, that it would be the last time he ever saw her as his wife. that within hours her carriage would lie broken at the bottom of a swollen river while he waited uselessly at home for a return that would never come. Alistair nodded, his eyes drifting once more toward the place where Clara Whitmore had vanished into the crowd. The ballroom around him continued its bright, indifferent celebration, musicians playing, couples dancing, laughter rising and falling like waves against a shore. But for the Duke of Grantham, the world had narrowed to a single question, one he intended to answer no matter what it cost him. Was it possible, after 5 years of mourning a woman the river had never returned to him, that fate had finally decided to give her back? Nathaniel Cole returned 3 days later with a folder of notes and a troubled expression that told Alistair the search had not been simple. They sat together in the study at Grantham House, rain tapping against the tall windows, the fire doing little to chase the chill from the room. "The story is strange," Nathaniel began, setting his papers on the desk between them. "A fisherman named Old Harlan found her on the rocks below Ravenscar, half drowned, with a wound on her head and no memory of her own name. There was no ship reported missing that week, no wreck, nothing to explain how she came to be there. The village doctor treated her for weeks before she could even speak clearly again. And no one thought to search further? No one asked where she had come from? They did at first, but there was no record of any missing woman matching her description within 100 miles, according to the local magistrate. The Baroness Ashcombe happened to be traveling through the area for her health and heard of the mysterious young woman. She took pity on her, gave her a place, a new name, and never looked back." Alistair rose from his chair and walked to the window, watching the rain streak silver lines down the glass. "The timing," he said quietly. "The accident happened the same week she was found." "I noticed that as well," Nathaniel admitted. "But Alistair, Ravenscar is nearly 60 miles from the bridge where Eleanor's carriage went into the river. The currents there do not run that direction. It would be almost impossible for a body, living or otherwise, to travel so far in so short a time. Almost impossible is not the same as impossible." Nathaniel did not answer that, because he knew his friend well enough to understand that hope, once lit, was not easily extinguished by mere geography. Instead, he handed over a small sketch, a rough likeness made by the village doctor for his own records, showing the woman as she had looked when first found, thin and pale, her hair cropped short where the wound had required it. Alistair studied the drawing for a long moment, his throat tight. "It could be anyone," he admitted at last, though his voice lacked conviction. And yet, Nathaniel agreed softly. Alistair decided that evening he would call upon the Baroness Ashcombe directly, under the pretense of a social visit, though both men understood his true purpose. Nathaniel offered to accompany him, but Alistair refused, insisting this was something he needed to face alone. He spent that night unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom he had once shared with Eleanor, a room he had left largely untouched since her disappearance, her hairbrush still resting on the vanity, her favorite shawl still draped over the chair by the window. He had not been able to bring himself to remove them, not in 5 years, and now he wondered if some part of him had always known this day might come. The Baroness Ashcombe's townhouse was smaller and less grand than Grantham House, but it possessed a warmth that Alistair's own home had long since lost. He was shown into a sitting room decorated with faded but well-loved furnishings, and it was there, moments later, that Clara entered, surprise evident on her face at finding the Duke waiting for her. "Your Grace," she said, offering a small curtsy. "I did not expect to see you again so soon." "I hope you will forgive the intrusion," Alistair said, rising to greet her. "I found myself unable to stop thinking of our conversation at the ball, and I wondered if you might indulge a lonely man with a bit more of your time." Clara studied him carefully, the same searching look she had given him before, as though trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces did not quite fit. "The Baroness is resting upstairs, but she has given me leave to entertain visitors in her stead. Please, sit." They spoke for over an hour, and Alistair found himself torn between the desperate need to ask her 100 questions and the fear that pressing too hard would frighten her away entirely. Instead, he let the conversation wander, asking about her days with the Baroness, her interests, the small details of an ordinary life built from nothing. She told him she loved gardening, though she could not explain why the scent of lavender sometimes made her unaccountably sad. She told him she had a habit of humming old tunes she could not name, melodies that seemed to rise from somewhere she could not remember. Alistair's chest tightened with every detail. Eleanor had loved lavender. Eleanor had hummed constantly, an old lullaby her own mother used to sing, one Alistair had heard so many times he could still recall its notes perfectly. "Would you hum it for me?" he asked suddenly. "The tune you mentioned." Clara looked at him oddly but obliged, a few soft notes escaping her lips, hesitant at first and then growing more confident as the melody seemed to find its own way out of her. Alistair felt the blood drain from his face. It was the lullaby, note for note, the very same song Eleanor used to sing while working in her garden, while brushing her hair before bed, while carrying their unborn child in the brief, precious months before the accident took everything from him. "Your Grace?" Clara asked, alarmed by whatever expression had crossed his face. "Are you unwell?" "Forgive me," he said, forcing himself to breathe evenly. "That song. Where did you learn it?" "I do not know," Clara admitted, her brow furrowing with the same frustration he had seen on her face when discussing her lost memory before. "It simply comes to me sometimes, in quiet moments. I have always assumed it was something from before, from whatever life I cannot remember." Alistair wanted desperately to tell her everything, to speak Eleanor's name aloud and watch for any flicker of recognition, but some instinct held him back. If he was wrong, if this truly was only a cruel coincidence, he risked frightening away a woman who had done nothing but offer him kindness. And if he was right, he did not yet understand how or why Eleanor had ended up 60 miles from where her carriage had gone into the river, with no memory of her own name, living quietly under the protection of a baroness who claimed to know nothing more than what the village doctor had told her. "It is a beautiful song," he said instead, his voice unsteady. "I once knew someone who sang it often." "Someone you lost," Clara said, not quite a question. There was a gentleness in her voice that told him she had guessed at least part of his sorrow, even if she could not know its true shape. "Yes," Alistair said simply, "someone I loved very much." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly between them, and Alistair studied her face, searching for any sign that she felt what he felt, that some buried memory stirred beneath the surface of her calm gray-blue eyes. He saw only confusion, and beneath it, something that might have been the beginning of unease. "You look at me the way a man looks at someone he has lost," Clara said quietly. "It frightens me a little, Your Grace, though I could not say exactly why." "I do not mean to frighten you," Alistair said quickly. "I only wish to understand. May I ask, has anything else come back to you? Any image, any face, any place that feels familiar though you cannot name it?" Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "Sometimes I dream of a large house, much grander than anything I have known since waking on those rocks. There is a garden with white roses, and a room with tall windows overlooking green hills. I dream of a man's voice, calling a name that is not mine, though it feels as though it should be. I have never told anyone this before. It seems foolish to speak of dreams as though they were memories." Alistair's hands trembled where they rested on his knees. Eleanor's garden at Grantham House was famous throughout the county for its white roses. Her favorite room had been the East Chamber, with its tall windows overlooking the green hills that rolled away toward the river. And the name that was not Clara's own but felt as though it should be, could only be one thing. "What name?" he asked carefully. "Do you hear in the dream?" Clara shook her head slowly. "It slips away before I can hold on to it, like trying to catch smoke. I only know that when I hear it, in the dream, I feel as though I am finally being called home." Clara reached for the teacup beside her, though her hand trembled slightly as she lifted it, and Alistair noticed the small gesture with the same aching attention he now paid to every movement she made. "There is one more thing," she said quietly, setting the cup down without drinking from it. "Sometimes, when the dream comes, I feel a hand resting against my stomach, gentle and protective, as though guarding something precious. I have never understood the feeling, since I have no child of my own, but it lingers with me for days afterward, a strange sense of loss for something I cannot name." Alistair's throat closed entirely. Eleanor had been carrying their child the night of the accident, barely 3 months along, still too early to show clearly but far enough that she had already begun the tender habit of resting her palm against her stomach whenever she sat quietly, a gesture Alistair had watched with growing wonder throughout those brief, precious weeks before the tragedy. He could not bring himself to explain the significance of this particular memory, not yet, not until he understood more fully what had truly happened that night, and whether the child she carried had somehow, impossibly, survived alongside her. "You look troubled," Clara observed gently, misreading the source of his silence. "Have I said something to upset you?" "No," Alistair managed, though his voice remained unsteady. "You have given me a great deal to think about, that is all. I hope you do not mind my questions. I know they must seem strange, coming from a man you barely know." "I do not mind," Clara said, and something in her expression softened further, a warmth that seemed to reach toward him instinctively, even as her conscious mind remained entirely ignorant of the connection between them. "In truth, Your Grace, our conversations are the first in 5 years that have made me feel as though the missing pieces of myself might someday be found. Most people treat my condition as a curiosity to be pitied, or worse, avoided entirely. as though lost memory were a contagious affliction. "You are the first person who has ever asked me these questions as though the answers truly mattered." "They matter more than you could possibly know," Alistair said softly. Before Alistair could press further, the sound of footsteps on the stairs announced the Baroness's arrival, and the moment shattered. Clara rose quickly to attend to the older woman, and Alistair was left standing alone by the fire, his mind a storm of certainty and doubt in equal measure. He no longer believed this was mere coincidence, mere grief playing tricks upon a broken heart. He believed, with a conviction that frightened him, that the woman across the room was his wife, though something or someone had stolen her memory and her name from her, and left her stranded in a life that was never meant to be hers. The question that remained, the question that would keep him awake through countless nights to come, was who had done this, and why? Because a carriage did not simply go off a bridge by accident on a clear night with an experienced driver at the reins, and a woman did not simply lose 5 years of memory and end up 60 miles from home without someone, somewhere, having arranged it so. As he took his leave that evening, bowing over Clara's hand with a formality that could not hide the emotion trembling beneath his composure, Alistair made a silent vow. Whatever had happened that night on the bridge, whatever conspiracy had stolen his wife from him and left her a stranger to herself, he would uncover it, no matter how deep the roots ran or how close to home the truth might lead him. The letter arrived at Grantham House 3 weeks after Alistair's visit to the Baroness, and it arrived without a signature, slipped beneath the study door sometime in the night by a hand no servant claimed to have seen. Alistair read it once, then twice, his blood running cold with each pass over the short, cramped handwriting. "Stop asking questions about the girl from Ravenscar," it read, "or you will lose her a second time, and this time there will be no rocks to catch her fall." He set the letter down with hands that shook, and for the first time since the ball, fear settled alongside the fragile hope that had been growing in his chest. He did not tell Clara about the letter. He did not tell anyone but Nathaniel, who read it with a grim expression, and immediately insisted on hiring a man to watch both Grantham House and the Baroness's townhouse discreetly. "Whoever sent this knows you are close to something," Nathaniel said. "That means we are close to something as well." Alistair found himself in an impossible position. Every instinct told him to protect Clara, to stay far away from her until he understood the danger properly, and yet every conversation they shared brought new fragments of memory bubbling to the surface, small clues that mattered more than any threat scrawled on paper. He decided, against Nathaniel's better judgment, that he would continue seeing her, but carefully, and he would say nothing of the letter until he understood who had sent it. Their meetings became more frequent over the following weeks, arranged under the guise of the Baroness's approval, since the old woman had taken a curious liking to the Duke and seemed to delight in matchmaking despite Clara's protests that nothing romantic was intended. They walked in the public gardens. They attended a concert together, seated with proper distance between them, though Alistair found his attention wandering constantly to the curve of Clara's profile in the candlelight. They spoke of small things and large things, and slowly, carefully, Clara began to open up about the strange fragments that haunted her sleep. "I dreamed of you last night," she confessed one afternoon, as they walked beneath a canopy of blooming chestnut trees. Her cheeks colored slightly at the admission, though her eyes held a seriousness that told Alistair this was no idle flirtation. "Not you as you are now, Your Grace, but younger perhaps, standing at the edge of a garden with white roses, holding out a ring. I woke feeling as though I had lost something precious, though I could not say what." Alistair stopped walking entirely, his heart hammering against his ribs. "A ring," he repeated softly. "Yes, gold, with a small sapphire at its center. It felt so real, Your Grace, as though I could still feel the weight of it on my finger." The ring he had given Eleanor on the day he proposed to her, beneath the very white roses Clara had described weeks before, had been exactly that, gold with a small sapphire, a family heirloom passed down through 3 generations of Grantham brides. He had never spoken to Clara of the ring. He had never described his proposal to anyone outside his closest family. There was no way, no possible way, for her to know these details unless the memory belonged to her. "Clara," he said, and his voice broke slightly on her name, "I must tell you something, and I ask that you hear me fully before you judge me mad." She turned to face him, her expression a mixture of curiosity and something like fear, as though some part of her already sensed the weight of what he was about to say. "5 years ago," Alistair began, "I was married to a woman named Eleanor. We were happy, happier than I ever thought possible, and she was carrying our first child when her carriage went off the bridge outside my estate on a stormy night. Her body was never found. I have spent 5 years believing her dead, until the night I saw you at the ball. And every day since has convinced me further that you are not simply a woman who resembles my wife. I believe, with everything in my heart, that you are Eleanor." Clara went very still, her face pale beneath the dappled sunlight filtering through the chestnut leaves. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and Alistair feared he had finally frightened her away entirely, that his desperate hope had cost him the fragile connection they had built. "That is not possible," she said finally, though her voice trembled. "I would remember. Surely I would remember a husband, a child, an entire life stolen from me." "Would you?" Alistair asked gently. "You suffered a wound to your head severe enough to erase your memory entirely. Is it so impossible that it might have taken your past along with your name?" "But the distance," Clara said, echoing the very argument Nathaniel had raised weeks before. "Ravenscar is so far from any bridge near your estate. How could I have traveled so far, injured, without anyone finding me sooner?" "I do not know," Alistair admitted, "but I believe someone arranged for you to be found far from home, precisely so that no one would think to search for you there. I believe the accident that night was no accident at all, and that someone within my own household orchestrated your disappearance to serve some purpose I have not yet uncovered." Clara sank onto a nearby bench, her hands pressed against her temples as though trying to physically hold back the flood of confusion threatening to overwhelm her. Alistair sat beside her, close but not touching, giving her the space she needed to process the impossible weight of what he was suggesting. "If what you say is true," Clara said slowly, "then someone tried to kill me, and very nearly succeeded. And that same person has been walking free for 5 years while I built a life in ignorance of everything I lost, and everything they took from me." "Yes," Alistair said quietly, "and 3 weeks ago I received a letter warning me to stop asking questions about you, or risk losing you again, permanently this time. Someone knows we are close to the truth, Clara, and they are frightened of what we might uncover." Fear flashed across her face, quickly followed by something Alistair had not expected, a fierce, steady anger that reminded him powerfully of the woman he had married, a woman who had never once backed down from injustice in all the years he had known her. "Then we must find out who they are," Clara said, her voice steadier now. "I will not spend the rest of my life hiding from a threat I do not understand, built upon a lie I did not choose." Over the following days, they began piecing together what fragments Clara could recall, comparing each dream and half-formed memory against the details of Eleanor's life that Alistair supplied. A small scar on her left hip, received falling from a horse at age 12, that matched precisely. A fondness for a particular shade of green that Clara had always favored without understanding why. The exact shade of Eleanor's favorite gown. The name of a childhood nurse, Bessie, that surfaced suddenly in Clara's mind one evening, and brought tears to her eyes, though she could not explain their cause. Piece by piece, the picture assembled itself, undeniable, despite its impossibility. Yet each new confirmation brought new danger as well. The man Nathaniel had hired to watch the Baroness's townhouse reported a stranger loitering near the servants' entrance on 2 separate occasions, a man in a dark coat who asked pointed questions about Clara's habits and schedule before disappearing into the crowded streets. Alistair doubled the household security and insisted, over Clara's mild protest, that she take a footman with her whenever she left the townhouse. It was during this tense period that Alistair began to seriously investigate his own household, starting with the servants who had been present the night of the accident. Most had since moved on to other positions, but a few remained, including the stable master who had prepared the carriage that fateful evening. Under gentle but persistent questioning, the old man finally admitted, with visible reluctance, that the carriage wheel which failed that night had shown signs of tampering, a detail he had never dared report at the time, for fear of losing his position, or worse. "Who would have had access to the carriage house that night?" Alistair pressed, his voice low and controlled despite the fury building inside him. The stable master hesitated, glancing around as though the very walls might carry his words to unfriendly ears. "Only family, your grace, and those closest to the family. I could not say for certain who among them might have wished harm upon the Duchess. I only know what I saw, and what I saw frightened me enough to hold my tongue for 5 long years." Alistair thanked the man and dismissed him, standing alone afterward in the very carriage house where his wife's fate had been sealed, staring at the empty space where the ruined carriage had once stood, before being sold for scrap in the aftermath of the tragedy. Only family, and those closest to the family. The words echoed through his mind as he considered, with growing dread, exactly how short that list truly was, and how close to his own heart the answer might lie. That evening, alone in his study, Alistair drew up a careful list of everyone who might have possessed both the motive and the opportunity to harm Eleanor. His mother, though grieving deeply at the time, had nothing to gain from her daughter-in-law's death, and had, if anything, adored Eleanor as the daughter she never had. The household steward had served the family faithfully for 30 years and stood to lose everything should any scandal touch the estate. Servants came and went with the ordinary rhythms of a great house, none possessing any particular grievance that Alistair could identify. The list narrowed, uncomfortably, disturbingly, to a single name that Alistair found himself reluctant to write down at all, though he knew avoiding it served no one. He thought of the many family gatherings over the past 5 years where his cousin had offered quiet condolences, had sat beside him at Eleanor's memorial service with an expression of genuine sorrow that Alistair had never once thought to question. He thought of the careful way his cousin had positioned himself as a support during the darkest months of grief, always present, always sympathetic, always ready with a comforting word or a steadying hand. Had it all been performance, calculated and cruel, designed to deflect suspicion while the truth remained buried beneath 5 years of carefully maintained grief? The thought sickened him, and yet he could not dismiss it. Not with the stable master's testimony fresh in his mind, and the timeline of Clara's discovery aligning so precisely with the night of the accident. He resolved to proceed carefully, gathering evidence before confronting anyone directly, aware that a false accusation against a member of his own family could destroy relationships and reputations beyond any hope of repair, while a true accusation left unproven might simply drive the guilty party into hiding, or worse, into more desperate action to protect their secret. Patience, he reminded himself, had never come naturally to him, but the stakes now were too high, and the woman he loved too precious, to risk any misstep born of haste. Edmund Grantham had always been a difficult man to read, and Alistair, sitting across from his cousin at dinner 2 nights later, found himself studying the familiar face with new and uncomfortable suspicion. Edmund was the son of Alistair's late uncle, next in line to inherit the dukedom should Alistair die without an heir. A fact that had never troubled Alistair before but now sat heavily in his mind as he watched his cousin refill his wineglass with practiced ease. "You seem distracted this evening," Edmund observed, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Nathaniel tells me you have taken quite an interest in the Baroness Ashcombe's companion. The talk of the season, apparently, the Duke of Grantham finally emerging from mourning." "News travels quickly," Alistair said carefully, keeping his own expression neutral despite the tension coiling in his chest. "It does, when the Duke himself provides such interesting material for gossip." Edmund smiled, but there was something calculating behind it that Alistair had never noticed before, or perhaps had simply chosen not to see. "I confess I am curious. What is it about this young woman that has captured your attention so completely?" Alistair chose his words with deliberate care, watching his cousin's reaction closely. "She reminds me a great deal of Eleanor. The resemblance is quite remarkable." Something flickered across Edmund's face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. But Alistair had spent enough years reading the subtle shifts of expression in courtrooms and negotiations to recognize genuine alarm when he saw it. "How strange," Edmund said, his voice a fraction too controlled. "Grief plays curious tricks on the mind, cousin. I would be careful not to let old wounds cloud your judgment." "Would you?" Alistair said quietly, watching Edmund's hand tighten almost imperceptibly around his wineglass. The dinner continued with strained politeness, but Alistair left that evening more convinced than ever that his cousin knew more than he claimed. He shared his suspicions with Nathaniel the following morning, and together they began quietly investigating Edmund's finances, his associations, and his movements in the weeks surrounding Eleanor's disappearance 5 years earlier. What they uncovered over the following days painted a damning picture. Edmund had been deeply in debt at the time of the accident, owing significant sums to moneylenders who had grown impatient with his repeated promises of payment. As heir presumptive to the dukedom, he had access to certain family funds that would have passed entirely out of his control had Alistair and Eleanor produced a living heir, which Eleanor's pregnancy had made a near certainty at the time of her disappearance. With Eleanor gone and no child born, Edmund's position as heir remained secure, along with the credit and influence that position afforded him among his creditors. More damning still, Nathaniel's inquiries revealed that Edmund had traveled north that same autumn, ostensibly to visit a distant relation, though no record existed of any such relation living in the region he claimed to have visited. The timing placed him within reasonable distance of Ravenscar during the very week Clara had been found on the rocks below the cliffs. "It is not proof," Nathaniel cautioned, laying out the evidence across Alistair's desk late one evening. "Circumstantial, all of it. A clever lawyer could explain away every piece." "Perhaps," Alistair said grimly, "but taken together, it paints a picture I can no longer ignore." He brought his findings to Clara the next day, watching her face carefully as he explained his suspicions about his cousin. She listened in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I do not remember him," she said slowly. "Not clearly, but when you say his name, something tightens in my chest, a feeling I cannot explain, as though some part of me recoils from it without understanding why." "That may simply be the stress of everything we have uncovered," Alistair said, though he did not entirely believe his own reassurance. "Perhaps," Clara agreed, though her expression remained troubled. "Or perhaps some memories protect themselves by staying hidden, because to remember fully would mean facing something too painful to bear." Their investigation continued in secret over the following weeks, gathering testimony from servants who had worked at Grantham House during the relevant period, cross-referencing Edmund's financial records with dates and locations that grew increasingly difficult to explain away as coincidence. Alistair engaged a discreet investigator, a former Bow Street officer named Percy Lang, who specialized in matters requiring both patience and confidentiality. Percy Lang's inquiries eventually led to a breakthrough neither Alistair nor Clara had anticipated. A driver who had once worked for Edmund, dismissed under vague circumstances shortly after Eleanor's disappearance, was located living in reduced circumstances in a neighboring county. After some persuasion, and the promise of financial compensation for his troubles, the man agreed to speak. He confessed, with visible shame, that he had driven Edmund to a remote crossing point on the night of the storm, where the two men had waited for the Duchess's carriage to pass on its return journey from a neighboring estate. He claimed he had not known the full extent of Edmund's plan, only that his employer intended to frighten the Duchess into losing her child, believing this alone would secure his inheritance without any need for permanent harm. What happened next, he insisted, had gone terribly wrong. The carriage wheel, already weakened by tampering arranged in advance, had failed at precisely the wrong moment on the storm-slicked bridge, sending the vehicle over the edge with far more violence than Edmund had apparently intended. He panicked, the driver told Percy Lang, his voice shaking with the memory. "We searched the water ourselves that night, briefly, before the storm grew too dangerous to continue. When we found nothing, Mr. Grantham told me the matter was finished, and that I would say nothing of what happened, or face consequences far worse than losing my position." The confession, though damning, still fell short of explaining exactly how Eleanor had survived the fall and traveled so far from the scene of the accident. That mystery remained unsolved until Percy Lang, following the thin trail of the driver's testimony, discovered records of a small fishing boat that had gone missing from a mooring near the bridge that same stormy night, later found drifting empty near the northern coast. It seemed the injured Duchess, thrown clear of the wreckage and carried by the swollen river current, had somehow found her way into the abandoned boat, or been placed there by some unknown hand, before drifting north along the coastline until the storm finally cast her ashore near Ravenscar. "It borders on miraculous," Percy Lang admitted when he delivered his final report to Alistair and Clara together in the study at Grantham House, "but the evidence, taken as a whole, leaves little room for any other explanation." Clara sat very still throughout the reading of the report, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. When Percy Lang finished, she rose and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening garden below, the same garden with its white roses that had haunted her dreams for months without explanation. "He tried to kill me," she said quietly, "and my child along with me, simply to protect his inheritance." "Yes," Alistair said, rising to stand beside her, though he did not touch her, sensing she needed the moment to absorb the full weight of the truth on her own terms. "And he has lived comfortably for 5 years while we grieved, believing himself safe from any consequence." "Then he must answer for it," Clara said, her voice hardening with a resolve that reminded Alistair powerfully and painfully of the woman he had lost and was only now beginning to fully understand he had found again. "Publicly, before all the same people who once offered their false condolences at my funeral. I want him to understand exactly what he has taken from us and exactly what it will cost him." Alistair studied her face for a long moment, seeing in her expression the same fierce determination that had first drawn him to Eleanor so many years before, and he felt something settle inside his chest that had been unmoored since the night of the accident. Whatever memories remained lost to her, whatever gaps time and trauma had carved into her mind, the essential core of who she was remained entirely, unmistakably intact. "Then we will make certain he answers for it," Alistair said, in front of everyone. That night, after Percy Lang and Nathaniel had departed and the house had fallen quiet around them, Clara lingered in the study rather than retiring to her rooms at the Baroness's townhouse. She stood before the tall shelves lined with family portraits, studying the painted faces of Grantham ancestors who stared back at her with the same steady, aristocratic composure that Alistair often wore in moments of stress. Among them hung a portrait she had not noticed before, tucked into a shadowed corner near the window, and when she stepped closer, Her breath caught sharply in her throat. It was her own face looking back at her, painted 3 years before the accident, commissioned as a wedding gift for Alistair's mother. She had no memory of sitting for the portrait, no recollection of the artist or the hours spent holding still while her likeness was captured in oil and canvas, and yet there was no mistaking the woman in the frame. The same gray-blue eyes, the same faint smile that seemed to hold some private joke, the same string of pearls she now recognized, with a jolt, as belonging to a small velvet box the Baroness had once shown her, pearls found among the effects washed ashore near Ravenscar that no one had ever thought to trace back to their rightful owner. "I did not know this hung here," she whispered when Alistair found her standing before it, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. "I could not bear to remove it," he admitted, coming to stand beside her, "though I also could not bear to look upon it for very long. My mother insisted it remain, said that some part of you deserved to keep watching over this house even after you were gone." He reached out, carefully, and took her hand. "I am glad, more than I can say, that you have returned to claim your place beneath it once more." Clara said nothing, only leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a long moment they stood together in silence before the portrait, two people slowly finding their way back to a life that had once seemed lost beyond any hope of recovery. The plan took shape over the following 2 weeks, built with the same careful precision Alistair applied to every matter of consequence in his life, though this mattered more to him than any business dealing or political maneuver ever had. Percy Lang continued gathering evidence, securing a written statement from the driver, along with financial records tracing the debts Edmund had owed at the time of the accident, and the moneylenders he had since repaid using funds that should never have been available to him had Alistair's marriage produced an heir. Clara, meanwhile, found herself caught between two identities: Clara Whitmore, the quiet companion who had built a modest life from nothing, and Eleanor Grantham, the Duchess whose memory was slowly reassembling itself piece by fractured piece with each passing day. The Baroness Ashcombe, informed of the truth in careful stages, wept openly upon learning that the young woman she had come to love as a daughter was in fact a duchess who had nearly been murdered by her own husband's cousin. "I always sensed there was more to you than a simple accident could explain," the Baroness said, clasping Clara's hands tightly in her own. "Some instinct told me you were meant for a greater purpose than companion to an old woman, though I confess I never imagined anything so extraordinary as this." More memories continued to surface as Clara spent increasing time at Grantham House, walking through rooms that had once been intimately familiar to her. Standing in the east chamber with its tall windows overlooking the green hills, she suddenly recalled, with startling clarity, the morning she had first learned she was carrying a child, the way Alistair had lifted her off her feet in his joy, spinning her around until she begged him, laughing, to set her down before he made her dizzy. She recalled her wedding day in fragments, the white roses woven through her hair, the weight of the sapphire ring sliding onto her finger, the sound of Alistair's voice as he promised to love her for the rest of his days. The return of these memories was not without pain. Alongside the joy of reclaiming her past came the grief of understanding exactly what had been stolen from her. 5 years of a life she should have lived as Alistair's wife. 5 years of a child who should have grown up surrounded by both parents' love. A child lost forever in the cold waters beneath that stormy bridge. Clara wept for that lost child in Alistair's arms one evening, and he wept alongside her, both of them finally allowing themselves to grieve properly for a loss they had each carried alone and incomplete for far too long. "We will have other children," Alistair whispered into her hair, holding her close as the fire burned low in the grate. "But we will never forget this one, I promise you that." Through it all, Edmund remained entirely unaware that his careful lies were unraveling around him. Alistair maintained a careful distance from his cousin during this period, offering nothing beyond the usual polite civility expected between family members, giving no hint of the storm building beneath the surface of their interactions. Nathaniel, meanwhile, quietly ensured that Edmund's movements were monitored, wary of any sign that he might attempt to flee should he sense the ground shifting beneath him. The opportunity Alistair had been waiting for arrived in the form of a grand ball hosted by the Duke's own household, the first such event Grantham House had held since Eleanor's disappearance 5 years earlier. Alistair announced the ball publicly as a celebration marking his emergence from mourning, though privately, he and Clara had planned it as the stage upon which the truth would finally be revealed, before all of society, including Edmund himself, who could not possibly decline an invitation from his own cousin without arousing suspicion. The night of the ball arrived with a tension that seemed to hum beneath every polite conversation and every swirl of silk across the dance floor. Clara, dressed in a gown of deep sapphire blue that matched the ring Alistair had commissioned to be remade for her, based on his careful memory of the original lost to the river, waited in a private chamber upstairs while the guests arrived below, watching the clock with a steady, determined calm that belied the pounding of her heart. Edmund arrived fashionably late, resplendent in his finest evening clothes, greeting his cousin with the same easy charm he had always displayed, entirely unaware that Percy Lang stood discreetly near the entrance, along with two magistrates Alistair had quietly arranged to attend the event under the guise of ordinary guests. The driver who had confessed his role in the conspiracy waited in an adjoining room, ready to be called forward should his testimony be required to settle any doubt among the assembled witnesses. Alistair waited until the ballroom had reached its fullest, until the orchestra paused between dances and the room settled into that particular lull where conversation could carry clearly from one end to the other. He climbed the small dais usually reserved for musical announcements, and the room gradually quieted, curious eyes turning toward the Duke, who so rarely commanded attention in such a manner. "Friends," Alistair began, his voice carrying steadily across the hushed ballroom, "5 years ago, I lost my wife in a terrible accident. Tonight I wish to share with you a truth that has only recently come to light, a truth that I believe every person in this room deserves to hear." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Alistair saw Edmund's face shift from polite curiosity to a flicker of unease, though his cousin maintained his composure admirably, unaware of exactly what was about to unfold. "On the night my wife's carriage went off the bridge outside this very estate, it was no accident at all," Alistair continued. "The wheel of her carriage had been deliberately tampered with, and her carriage was deliberately intercepted by a man who feared losing his inheritance should my wife successfully deliver our child." The murmurs grew louder, and Edmund's face had gone pale, his eyes darting toward the exits as though calculating the possibility of escape, though Percy Lang and the two magistrates had already moved to block the nearest doors with quiet efficiency. "My wife survived that night," Alistair said, his voice rising with barely controlled emotion, "though she lost our child, and lost her own memory of who she was for 5 long years, living under a false name, believing herself alone in the world, while her attacker walked free among us, attending our gatherings, sharing our meals, waiting patiently for the day I might finally die so he could claim the title he had already tried so desperately, and so viciously, to secure." At this moment, the door at the far end of the ballroom opened, and Clara entered, no longer dressed as Clara Whitmore, companion to a minor baroness, but as Eleanor Grantham, Duchess of the house, her chin held high despite the visible tremor in her hands, walking with a grace and dignity that seemed to still every conversation in the room. Gasps rippled through the crowd as recognition dawned across dozens of faces, older guests who had known the Duchess before her disappearance, staring in open astonishment at the woman they had believed dead and buried 5 years prior. Edmund made a sudden movement toward the nearest exit, but the magistrates were faster, stepping forward to block his path with quiet but unmistakable authority. "Edmund Grantham," one of them announced, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence of the ballroom. "You are under arrest on charges of attempted murder and conspiracy, based on sworn testimony and evidence gathered against you." "This is madness," Edmund sputtered, his composure finally cracking entirely as every eye in the ballroom turned toward him with dawning horror and disgust. "You cannot possibly believe the ravings of some woman claiming to be a duchess who has been dead for 5 years. "I do not merely claim it," Clara said, her voice steady and clear as it carried across the room, silencing whatever protest Edmund had intended to continue. "I remember it now, Edmund. I remember your voice in the darkness that night, ordering your driver to intercept my carriage. I remember the terror of the wheel giving way beneath me, the cold water closing over my head, the certainty that I was going to die alone in that river with my unborn child. I have spent 5 years rebuilding a life from the wreckage you left behind, and tonight, I am finally taking back the name and the life you tried to steal from me." The driver was brought forward at this point, his testimony repeating for the assembled crowd what he had already confessed to Percy Lang, and the weight of corroborating evidence, combined with Edmund's own panicked and increasingly incoherent protests, left little room for doubt among the horrified guests. Edmund was led from the ballroom in disgrace, his pleas for mercy falling on ears that had already witnessed the full extent of his betrayal, while behind him, the ballroom erupted into a storm of astonished conversation, the scandal of the season unfolding in real time before the very eyes of society's most prominent families. Alistair descended from the dais and crossed the room to where Clara stood, still trembling slightly from the effort of confronting her attacker before so vast an audience. He took her hands in his, uncaring of the hundreds of eyes now fixed upon them both, and for a moment the noise and spectacle of the ballroom seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the two of them standing together in the space where their reunion had first begun months before. "You were magnificent," he murmured, his voice thick with pride and relief in equal measure. "I was terrified," Clara admitted, a shaky laugh escaping her despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I have never in my life spoken before so many people, and I feared my voice would fail me entirely before I finished." "It did not fail you," Alistair said. "Not for a single moment." Around them, the guests began to recover from their initial shock, and a slow ripple of applause started near the front of the crowd, spreading outward until the entire ballroom rang with the sound, not for the scandal itself, but for the courage the Duchess had shown in reclaiming her name and her truth before all of them. Old friends who had once mourned Eleanor's passing pressed forward to offer their astonished congratulations, while others who had barely known her before her disappearance found themselves swept up in the extraordinary romance of the story now unfolding, a tale that would be told and retold in drawing rooms across the country for years to come. The orchestra, uncertain how to proceed amid such unprecedented circumstances, eventually resumed playing, and slowly, tentatively, the ball continued around the Duke and Duchess standing at its center, no longer strangers to one another, no longer separated by 5 cruel years of loss, but together at last, exactly as fate had always intended. In the weeks that followed the ball, the scandal of Edmund Grantham's crimes swept through society with the force of a winter storm, dominating every drawing room conversation and every whispered exchange behind fluttering fans. Edmund's trial, when it finally came before the courts, drew crowds eager to witness the downfall of a man who had so nearly succeeded in claiming a dukedom through murder and deception. The driver's testimony, combined with the financial records Percy Lang had painstakingly assembled, along with Clara's own steadily returning memories, left the jury with little difficulty in reaching their verdict. Edmund was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to transportation, his name struck from the family record, his claim to any future inheritance permanently and irrevocably severed. For Alistair and Clara, though, the true significance of those weeks lay not in the courtroom, but in the slow, careful process of rebuilding a life together, a life interrupted so cruelly 5 years before. Clara's memories continued to return, though never all at once, arriving instead in gentle waves that sometimes brought joy and sometimes brought fresh grief for all that had been lost. Alistair remained patient through every stage of this process, never pressing her to remember faster than her mind was ready to allow, content simply to have her present beside him after so many years of believing her gone forever. The Baroness Ashcombe, though heartbroken to lose her beloved companion, insisted on remaining close to the family she had unknowingly helped protect during Clara's years of amnesia. She became a frequent guest at Grantham House, delighting in watching the woman she had raised as a daughter slowly reclaim her true identity as Duchess, while never fully relinquishing the warmth of the bond they had built together as Clara and the Baroness, separate from the grander history now unfolding around them. Word of the extraordinary events spread far beyond the immediate circle of society gossip, reaching even the royal court itself, where the king expressed his own astonishment at the tale of a duchess returned from the dead, and his fury at the treachery that had nearly cost an innocent woman her life. A formal audience was arranged, during which Alistair and Clara were received with honors befitting the remarkable ordeal they had survived, the king himself remarking that few stories in his long memory had captured the public imagination so thoroughly, nor deserved such a happy resolution after such profound suffering. Yet for all the public celebration surrounding their reunion, the private moments meant far more to Alistair and Clara than any formal recognition ever could. There were quiet evenings spent walking through the gardens at Grantham House, past the white roses that had haunted Clara's dreams for so long, before she understood their significance. There were long conversations late into the night, Alistair patiently filling in the gaps of memory that still eluded her, sharing stories of their courtship, their wedding, the brief joyful months of her pregnancy before tragedy struck, allowing her to reclaim not just facts but the emotional texture of a life she had nearly lost entirely. Slowly, the fragile connection between the Duke and the woman who had once been a stranger to him deepened once more into the profound love that had first bound them together as husband and wife. Clara, though she would sometimes still catch herself thinking of certain habits and preferences as belonging to Clara Whitmore rather than Eleanor Grantham, found that the two identities were gradually merging into a single integrated sense of self, richer perhaps for having survived such an extraordinary trial by fire. 6 months after the ball that had exposed Edmund's crimes, Alistair proposed to her again, kneeling in the very garden with white roses that had featured so prominently in both her recovered memories and her once inexplicable dreams. He presented her with the very sapphire ring commissioned to match the original lost to the river, and though technically they remained legally married throughout the entire ordeal, both agreed that a second ceremony, a fresh beginning built upon hard-won honesty and renewed devotion, would help mark the true completion of their journey back to one another. The wedding, when it took place the following spring, drew guests from across the country, eager to witness the joyful conclusion of a story that had captivated the nation for months. Clara walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, white roses woven through her hair exactly as they had been on her first wedding day, though this time she walked with the full weight of her memories intact, understanding completely the depth of the love waiting for her at the altar. Alistair watched her approach with tears he made no effort to hide, overwhelmed by gratitude for a second chance he had never dared to hope for during those long, grief-filled years of believing her lost forever. In his vows, Alistair spoke of the 5 years he had spent mourning a woman he believed dead, and the extraordinary gift of discovering she had been alive all along, waiting only for the truth to set her free. He spoke of the strength she had shown in rebuilding her life from nothing, twice over, first as Clara Whitmore, and then again as she reclaimed her true self as Eleanor Grantham. Clara, in turn, spoke of the terror of waking on unfamiliar rocks with no memory of who she was, and the profound joy of finally understanding, through Alistair's unwavering devotion, exactly where and to whom she truly belonged. Nathaniel Cole served as best man, having stood beside his friend through the darkest years of grief and the extraordinary weeks of discovery that followed. The Baroness Ashcombe wept openly throughout the ceremony, proud beyond words of the young woman she had once found broken and nameless, now standing radiant as a duchess reclaiming her rightful place in the world. Percy Lang, whose careful investigation had unraveled the conspiracy that nearly destroyed 2 lives, attended as an honored guest, his quiet professionalism having played no small part in bringing the truth to light. As the newly remarried couple danced their first dance beneath the same chandeliers where Alistair had first glimpsed Clara's face across a crowded ballroom, he found himself marveling at the strange and terrible journey that had led them back to this moment. 5 years of grief, weeks of desperate investigation, the exposure of a betrayal that had nearly cost everything, all of it converging finally into this single perfect moment, her hand in his, her eyes meeting his with complete and unwavering recognition. "I never stopped loving you," Alistair murmured against her hair as they turned slowly across the dance floor. "Not for a single day in all those years." "I know," Clara whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. "I felt it, even before I understood why, even when I could not remember your face or your name. Some part of me always knew I belonged with you." Outside the tall windows of Grantham House, the white roses bloomed in the spring evening, the same roses that had witnessed their first proposal, borne silent witness to years of grief and separation, and now stood as testament to a love that had survived betrayal, tragedy, and the cruel erasure of memory itself. The Duke and Duchess of Grantham had endured what few couples could imagine surviving, and yet here they stood, together again, their future stretching ahead of them unburdened by the shadows of the past, ready at last to build the life that had so nearly been stolen from them forever. Later that evening, as the last guests departed and the great house finally fell quiet, Alistair and Clara climbed together to the East Chamber, the room with its tall windows overlooking the green hills that had featured so vividly in the dreams which once haunted her sleep without explanation. They stood before the window in comfortable silence, watching moonlight silver the rolling countryside beyond the glass, the white roses in the garden below glowing faintly pale against the darker shapes of hedge and lawn. "Do you remember everything now?" Alistair asked softly, his arms settling around her waist as she leaned back against him. "Not everything," Clara admitted. "There are still gaps, small moments that remain lost to me, conversations and mornings and ordinary days that time and trauma have simply erased beyond recovery. But I no longer feel as though I am missing the most important parts. I remember you. I remember loving you. I remember, now, precisely why I have felt drawn to this house, this garden, this window, from the very first moment I set foot inside these walls, though I could not then have explained the reason." "That is enough," Alistair said, pressing a kiss to the crown of her head. "More than enough. We have the rest of our lives to recover whatever remains, and I intend to spend every one of those days helping you find your way back to whatever pieces still elude you, for as long as it takes." Clara turned in his arms to face him fully, her eyes searching his with the same open honesty that had first drawn him to her, whether as Eleanor before the accident or as Clara after it, the same fundamental spirit shining through regardless of the name she carried. "I love you," she said simply. "In every version of myself I have ever been. That much, at least, I have never once forgotten, even when I could not remember why." Outside, the wind moved gently through the white roses, and somewhere in the distance an owl called across the darkened hills, the great house settling into peaceful stillness around the two people who had fought so hard, and endured so much, to find their way back to this single, quiet, perfect moment together. 2 years after the wedding that had drawn the eyes of an entire nation, a carriage made its way slowly along the coastal road toward Ravenscar, its wheels well maintained and its driver instructed to travel with particular care over every bridge along the route. Inside sat the Duke and Duchess of Grantham, along with their young daughter, barely a year old, sleeping peacefully against her mother's shoulder despite the gentle rocking of the journey. Clara had asked to make this trip for a long time, though something had always delayed it: the trial, the wedding, the demands of running a great estate, and later, the joyful chaos of welcoming a new child into the world. But now, with her daughter old enough to travel and her own memories fully restored, she felt ready at last to return to the place where her second life had begun, the rocky shore where a fisherman named Old Harlan had pulled a broken, nameless woman from the edge of death. They found him still living in the same small cottage above the cliffs, older now, his hands more weathered, but his eyes just as sharp as they had been the day he first spotted a flash of pale fabric among the rocks below. He answered the door to find a Duke and Duchess standing on his doorstep, and for a moment he simply stared, unable to reconcile the elegant woman before him with the broken, half-drowned stranger he had carried up the cliff path 5 years before. "I never learned what became of you," Old Harlan said, once he had recovered enough to invite them inside for tea. "I heard rumors, of course, wild stories about a duchess returned from the dead, but I confess I never imagined the woman in those stories was the very same one I pulled from the sea." "I owe you my life," Clara said simply, taking his weathered hand in both of hers. "Had you not found me that morning, had you simply walked past and assumed the rocks held nothing but debris from the storm, I would not be standing here today, and my daughter would never have been born." Old Harlan waved off her gratitude with the gruff embarrassment of a man unused to such formal thanks, though his eyes shone with unmistakable emotion as he studied the sleeping child in Alistair's arms. They spent the afternoon together, Clara asking careful questions about those first confused days after her rescue, filling in small details that even her restored memory could not supply, since she had been largely unconscious through much of that critical period. Old Harlan spoke of the storm that night, fiercer than any he could recall in 40 years of fishing those waters, and of finding the small abandoned boat washed up nearly a mile from where he later found Clara herself, suggesting she had likely been thrown from the vessel before it ran aground, surviving the final stretch through sheer determination and the mercy of a falling tide. Before they left, Alistair arranged for a generous sum to be settled upon the old fisherman, enough to ensure comfortable retirement whenever he chose to leave the sea behind, along with funds to repair the cottage that had weathered so many storms alongside its owner. Old Harlan protested the gift with genuine reluctance, insisting he had done nothing more than any decent person would have done, but Alistair remained firm, unwilling to let the debt go unacknowledged. "You gave me back my wife," he told the old fisherman simply, "and gave my daughter the chance to know her mother. There is no sum of money that could properly repay such a gift, but I hope this allows you some measure of comfort in the years ahead." Their journey continued the following day to the village doctor who had treated Clara through those first difficult weeks of recovery, a kind and thorough man named Dr. Ellery Prescott, now grayer than Clara remembered from her fragmented recollections of that period, though his manner remained just as gentle and precise as it had been when he first stitched the wound on her head and gently coaxed her back from the edge of death. He wept openly upon learning the full story behind the mysterious patient he had treated years before, admitting he had often wondered what became of her after the Baroness took her south, and had never dared hope the ending might prove so remarkable. Returning to Grantham House at the end of their journey, Clara felt a profound sense of completion settle over her, a closing of the circle that had begun on that storm-tossed night 5 years before. She no longer felt divided between two identities, Clara Whitmore and Eleanor Grantham, but understood instead that both had been true expressions of the same enduring self, one shaped by loss and quiet resilience, the other reclaimed through love and unwavering determination. She carried the strength of Clara Whitmore forward into her life as Duchess, grateful for the resourcefulness that difficult period had taught her, even as she embraced fully the life and love that had always been rightfully hers. Edmund Grantham, meanwhile, lived out his sentence in distant transportation, his name rarely spoken within the walls of Grantham House, except on the occasions when Alistair reflected, usually late at night with Clara beside him, on how close they had come to losing everything to a man's greed and desperation. There was no forgiveness offered for what Edmund had done, no reconciliation sought or desired, but there was also, Clara found, a gradual release of the bitter anger that had consumed her in the immediate aftermath of learning the truth. She chose instead to focus her energy on the life she had built and continued to build, refusing to let his cruelty define the remainder of her days. The gardens at Grantham House flourished under her renewed attention. The white roses that had haunted her dreams before she understood their significance, now tended with careful devotion, expanded each season with new varieties she selected herself, transforming the grounds into something even more beautiful than they had been before the tragedy that once nearly destroyed everything she held dear. Visitors to the estate often remarked on the particular joy that seemed to radiate from the Duke and Duchess whenever they walked together through those gardens, a happiness earned through extraordinary suffering, and made all the more precious for having been so nearly lost forever. As their daughter grew older, Clara made a quiet decision to share the full story with her eventually, not as a burden to carry but as a testament to resilience, to the power of truth to overcome even the most carefully constructed lies, and to the enduring strength of love that had refused to accept a false ending, even when the entire world had already moved on in grief. She wanted her daughter to understand that even in the darkest circumstances, even when identity itself seemed stripped away entirely, something essential could survive, waiting patiently to be recognized and reclaimed by those who refused to stop searching for the truth. On quiet evenings, Alistair would often find Clara standing at the tall windows of the East Chamber, watching the sunset paint the green hills in shades of gold and rose, and he would join her there in comfortable silence, grateful beyond words for every ordinary moment they now shared, moments that had once seemed impossibly lost to him during those 5 long years of solitary grief. Their love, tested by tragedy and betrayal, tempered by loss and eventual triumph, had grown into something even stronger than what they had known before, a partnership built not merely on the easy happiness of their early courtship, but on the hard-won understanding that came from surviving the very worst that fate could offer, and choosing, again and again, to find their way back to one another. Years later, when their daughter had grown old enough to ask questions about the small portrait that hung in the study, the same one Clara had discovered on that quiet evening before her second wedding, Alistair and Clara would sit together with her by the fire and tell the story slowly, carefully, choosing which parts belonged to a child's understanding and which would wait for older years. They spoke of courage more than tragedy, of the fisherman who never hesitated to climb down dangerous rocks for a stranger, of the doctor who tended a nameless patient with the same devotion he gave any other, of the friends who never stopped searching for answers even when the truth seemed impossible to uncover. They spoke less of Edmund himself and more of what his betrayal had ultimately failed to destroy: a marriage, a family, a legacy of love that had proven far stronger than any conspiracy built upon greed. Grantham House itself seemed to carry the memory of those years within its very walls. The East Chamber where dreams of a forgotten life had once visited a woman with no name. The garden where 2 proposals had taken place beneath the same white roses. The ballroom where truth had finally triumphed over 5 years of carefully constructed lies. Visitors who did not know the family's history often remarked on a certain quality to the estate, a warmth that seemed to radiate from every room, though few could have guessed at the extraordinary trials that had shaped the happiness now so evident in every corner of the house. For Alistair and Clara, that warmth was no mystery at all, but simply the natural result of love that had been tested nearly to its breaking point and had emerged, against every reasonable expectation, whole and unshakable, ready to carry them both through whatever years still lay ahead.